Hello, I'm Emily Bellet, founder of Vestpod and author of You're Not Broke, You're Pre-Rich, and you're listening to The Wallet. Every week we give you the best tips, guidance, and a good dose of inspiration and motivation to manage your money better. Women often shoulder 2/3 or more of the unpaid domestic work and childcare responsibilities for their homes and families. This has significant effects on relationships, wealth, and overall well-being. In this episode, I have Rodsky discussing how to make societal change one partnership at a time, aiming to redistribute domestic work and redefine relationships. We look into actionable systems outlined in her book and platform, Fair Play, addressing mental load, returning to work, and the importance of prioritizing alone time. Remember that we are not certified financial advisors. Information shared in this podcast is for educational purposes only and does not constitute financial advice. PensionBee is on a mission to help pension savers across the UK. Each month, their Pension Confident podcast helps listeners understand the world of personal finance, exploring pensions, ISAs, mortgages, and more. Host Philippa Lamb is joined by a panel of expert guests who answer questions from can you afford to have kids? To should you invest in a pension or an ISA? The Pension Confident podcast is available right now wherever you get your podcasts. Just remember that anything discussed should not be regarded as financial advice, and when investing, your capital is at risk.
You know, I don't think anybody sets out to be an expert on the gendered division of labor. When I went to law school, I'm Gen X. I went to law school and graduated in 2002, but I started in 1999, and my professor was a now U.S. Senator, Elizabeth Warren. She asked us what we want to do with our law degree, and I said that I wanted to be a senator from New York, president of the United States, and a Knick City Dancer, which is a basketball team in New York. And I had these really big dreams. And what I want to tell your listeners is that I thought I'd be smashing all of these glass ceilings. That was sort of what we've been told, that women have it better than anyone's ever had it before, that the generation before us had paved the way for us to have our own bank accounts, to take out our own credit cards. The divorce laws were easier so women could get out of marriages. This is in the US at least. But really, if you look at my life 10 years later, the only thing that I was smashing was definitely not glass ceilings. It was peas for my toddler while breastfeeding a baby, Ben, trying to negotiate a return to the workforce for less of a salary in exchange for flexibility. You can start seeing all the financial decisions start happening after you have kids, putting my husband's career first, saying that my job is more flexible, so I should do more of the pickups and the drop-offs for our toddler. And slowly, my career started to erode. And I ended up in a place where I felt like I was a gray version of myself. That's sort of where the Fair Play story begins. This 10 years later, after my big dreams, where I looked at myself and I said, none of those dreams that I thought I'd have for myself were coming true.
Well, I think many people can relate to this story. I can definitely relate to the same story. I started working in finance and private equity and started setting up businesses, but at the same time, I had my 3 children, just like you. So that means, more time. And I'm very happy to spend time with them, but that has such a big impact on our life and on our savings, on how we earn money. And you talk a lot about also this invisible work. Can you talk a little bit about that and when did you realize that wasn't working for you?
So I tell a story that my husband Seth sent me a text that said, I'm surprised you didn't get blueberries. And that's true. This all happened to me. I got in the car with a breast pump, a diaper bag in the passenger seat of my car, gifts for a newborn baby to return in the backseat of my car. I was racing to pick up a toddler from a toddler daycare program. I had started my own firm because the workplace that I was working in was hostile at that time to working mothers. They wouldn't even give me and guarantee me a place to pump. And so I had left. I now say opted out. I now say that I was forced out. We never opt out of paid work in corporations. They force us out. And so I was already feeling very isolated in my life, abandoned by my workplace, sort of abandoned by my community that was calling me Zach's mom at the time. They didn't even know my name. And on top of that, then my husband decides to assume that I'm the fulfiller of his smoothie needs. It was a really bad day. And I started to cry. I live in Los Angeles. We don't take traffic lightly here. So for me to pull over on the side of the road and cry instead of go to pick up my son, things had to be really bad. And they were really bad because this was 2011. We didn't have anybody having real talks about the decisions we make and how they can affect our finances or our control or our choices later on. But I had been in a marriage for 10 years. I'd put my husband's career first. I had become the default, a statistic that I was undeniably living that I didn't even know at the time, that women married to men shoulder 2/3 or more of what it takes to run a home and family. And so after that day, I started to wake up. I wasn't there yet. I didn't write Fair Play until 2019. This was 2011. So it took me 8 years to really wake up to what was happening around me. But I didn't have podcasts. I didn't have social media. I just had myself and the belief that something was wrong, that someone who had so many big dreams to go to a place that was so gray and small, that it wasn't my fault. I sort of knew that something else was going on.
But also, I guess we were following a pattern, cultural, societal expectations of, it's fine. Like, that's historically how we've been doing it, women staying at home and men working. And of course, now we realize it really doesn't work. I mean, how did you start exploring this concept of fair play and rebalancing of, responsibilities, so domestic responsibilities, maybe also financial responsibilities, because that takes a big shift, that takes going against what, probably a lot of people were saying at the time. So what was the journey to get to fair play?
Such a great question. And Emily, what I didn't realize was actually I was going to be pushing up against 2,000 years of patriarchal ideas of home confinement. What I thought I was just going to come up with maybe some ideas for organizational tips for the home because I'm a lawyer. I design organizations for a living. I work for families that look like, the HBO show Succession, and your listeners should feel bad for me. But what I do for those families is I bring grace and humor and generosity to really complex organizational decisions around family businesses, which you touched on in this podcast, family foundations, the transfer of wealth. Because I knew that those organizations were very highly complex, and I sort of knew that there was a secret formula in my work over a decade to get those organizations to work well. And that secret formula is boundaries, systems, and communication. And as a consultant, as a lawyer for those families, I work on a practice of boundaries, systems, and communication. I started to think to myself, well, the only people I see in this space are pediatricians who say what to expect, what you're expecting, OBGYNs that never touch unpaid labor after a baby comes and basically abandon you after a 6-week visit. There's other people in our lives, like our workplace, who tell us we're never allowed to bring our identities to work. So there was a what to expect when you're expecting book, which was like told me my child was going to be a jelly bean. But I didn't have anybody that was talking about the home as an organization. So I just got curious. I got curious and said to myself, what if I applied the same organizational systems that are in place for my clients to my own home? And that's how Fair Play evolved. I started with systems because it's easier than boundaries and communication. Boundaries means toppling that 2,000 years of messaging that women belong in the home. Communication means that we have to teach women to ask for what they need, which we're also told not to do. Those are big gendered issues. So I figured, let me just start with systems. If I can design a system, then we can start having these conversations to unwind the assumptions that women are better at adulting, that we all can benefit from getting more time back, from having more efficiency in our home. Because what I realized was that even my Aunt Marianne's Mahjong group had more clearly defined expectations in the home. In that community, if you don't bring snack twice to the group, Emily, you're out. But our homes, we're waiting to decide who's taking our dog out, right when it's about to take a pee on the rug. It just doesn't make any sense. And so that's where I started. I started with a practical system to help couples, roommates, hetero cisgender families, LGBTQIA couples divide up domestic labor for efficiency in the home. That sort of was the easiest place to start. And that's what Fair Play became. It became 100 cards, a system to tell you, here's the 100 cards, I've done it for you. There's 60 cards in play. It's gamified if you don't have children. You're adding 40 cards when you bring a child into the world. So understand your life is going to change because your work is basically doubling. And you have to find time to do that work. And it can't just all fall on one person, regardless of how much money each person makes. So you can imagine all of those steps to get to even the system. I had to unpack assumption after assumption after assumption. And one woman finally said to me, what Fair Play taught her, and this is one of my favorite quotes, it taught her that she actually doesn't have a magical vagina that whispers in her ear what her husband's mother wants for Christmas. I love that. I said, if that's what it taught you, then I've literally, I can just hang it up now and walk away from this work.
Thank you so much, Eve. I love this quote. Can you tell me about the main principles of Fair Play for people who are interested in the topic? They sort of want to do this first exercise, or maybe they want to get the cards. What are you going to ask them to do? What are the main systems that they can start thinking about? And after, maybe we'll talk about communications and how to probably try to convince your partner to use it, to use the cards, to read your book.
Yeah, I think there's two camps of people. There are people who are ready for the system right away. And for people who will say to me, in the time it takes me to tell him, her, they what to do, or to try to bring this to the table, I should just do it myself. So we'll talk to those people because that's a very valid critique. But for those who say, you may have a willing partner who says, I just want to help, just tell me what to do, or you feel like there's more fairness, or you're about to have a child, or you have a boyfriend, or there's a man in your life, maybe he's even a roommate who may not have been conditioned to unpaid labor in the same way, then we can start with the system. The system is very, very simple. It's based on one question that changed my life. And that question that I asked in Canada, in France, in Sweden, in Norway, in Singapore, over 16 countries, we asked this question. And that question was, how does mustard get in your refrigerator? That changed my life because up until Fair Play, the data we had about time use was skewed because men were overreporting what they did in the home and women consistently underreported what they did. So if I asked somebody who handles groceries, I would hear, well, we both do. So to get at the real problem, I asked, how does mustard get in your refrigerator? And it was great because not everybody uses mustard, but everyone across the world loves condiments. So I could sub in a different condiment if mustard wasn't the right one. And here's what I heard. What I heard was women married to men, and especially after children, are the ones noticing that their second son, Johnny, likes yellow mustard with his protein. So why that was helpful was because when we notice something, we have a new idea, we want to solve a problem in the workplace, in project management, we call that step conception. So I can write down and say, women are holding conception for this mustard question. And then I heard from women that they were often 99% of the time the ones who monitor the mustard for when it runs low. And they're the ones getting stakeholder buy-in from their family for what they need on the grocery list. That's what we call planning. So I'd write down, planning. Women are holding the planning. And then they say their partner gets involved to go to the grocery store with a list that this woman gave him. And they bring home spicy Dijon every fucking time. When you ask for yellow mustard. And then you say, how can I trust this person with my living will? They can't even bring home the right type of mustard. So why that question was so important was not only did I see where the breakdown was in the efficiency of the home, which is that one person is holding the conception and planning and another person is coming in at execution. So we eliminate that in Fair Play. It's an ownership mindset. When you hold a card, whether it's for 1 day, for 1 year, you redeal that card with full ownership. I am away. You are in charge of the full ownership of when the school calls, which means you're going to be having the one to leave your job, pick up the kid if they're sick. Don't call me. So that's the conception, planning, execution. But it also taught me this idea that the reason why we don't value all the time it takes to do unpaid labor is because it's the behind the scenes work. We only see the execution. So those 2 points allowed me to say, go for it, experiment and try. If you are in that position where you can go straight to the system, you will bring immediate changes to your home by adopting a conception, planning, and execution mindset. In my home, we started with 1 card. Of the 100, I was holding them all. Seth started with extracurricular sports for 2 young kids. I got 6 hours of my week back because he was on an 85-person text chain to coordinate where the practices were. He was ordering equipment on Amazon and returning it when it didn't fit. None of that was on my plate anymore. So I like to look at the home and the system as ownership, not 50-50, because then it can work for any single type of home configuration, including roommates. So that's where you start. The boundaries and communication are harder, and we can get into that if you feel like there's no way I could bring up these conversations. But if you're ready, the system is there for you.
Maybe, I'd love to talk a little bit about the communication, actually, and maybe we can talk about the money angle if that we can probably get something more specific. But what is the importance of communication and setting clear, expectations? How do we get started, especially when it comes to finances?
Explicitly define expectations lead to accountability and trust. Accountability and trust are the 2 most important things that you can have in any marriage. Now, accountability and trust erodes. So fair play comes up the most because men who often out-earn women, the couple will prioritize a man's job in many situations. And when they do that, women start taking economic risks because somebody in a greedy workforce, that's what Claudia Golden, our new Nobel Prize winner, calls it, when someone has to overwork, the other person is going to take a step back, start handling the mental load, all those decisions we were just talking about. The amount of unpaid labor it takes to run a household is so much more than a full-time job. It's thousands of hours a year. So that person's job will then be affected, but then becomes a cycle because then women will start to say, well, my job is more flexible, but flexible jobs earn less. So then what happens is the economic earner starts to make more money, and the risks start to fall more and more on the person who has the more flexible job or who leaves the paid workforce. And the reason why is obvious, because the person with the money can leave. They can leave that relationship freely because they have economic power. Women start to report to me over time, oh my God, I can't leave this relationship. I don't have family money to fall back on. I have no marketable skills anymore. And now the court system is telling me I have a duty to become self-sufficient. I used to be in PR, now I'm driving Uber. So women end up having to scramble economically if they want to change the relationship. So explicitly defined expectations are everything. I absolutely believe in something called the postnup or a prenup. And what I mean by that is it doesn't necessarily have to be the type of contract you see in the news with celebrities, but you have to understand how you're going to be compensated for the unpaid labor in the home if you choose to take that on, because that person is the one taking the economic risks. And I don't think people understand this enough. I think we get into these traditional gender roles because we think they sound fun, or how great it would be to be home with my kids. And all that is fine and good, but it leaves women in such economic straits later on in their lives. And I keep seeing it over and over and over again. And I think we have to address these issues, or else we're going to be in this vicious cycle forever.
And I understand that, when you're at a dating stage or, beginning of the relationship, you can bring these topics, you can, financially empower yourself, improve your literacy around money and have these conversations. What about couples that have been together for a long time, never really had this conversation, don't have, this prenup. They think it's, one of them feel it's not working. Usually, maybe probably women. How can they approach these discussions around, income, earning potential, financial contribution, and sort of try to rebalance? Because I feel they will have to lose something to win something, or one of them will feel like, I'm giving too much. So how can we rebalance these relationships if we feel they don't work?
Oh, I love it. Well, the first thing is we have to get rid of this assumption. I make my wife's life, if they're married to a man who makes more, I make my wife's life because she gets to eat bonbons all day and I, have to bring home money and it's stressful. There's a lot of people who say, you want me to do unpaid labor too? How much more can I do? I support this entire family. This time is money thing is a complete disaster for women. Time is time. We each get 24 hours in a day and we get time. We should be able to get time choice over how we use those hours. That's a true boundary. Women, unfortunately, have been conditioned to breach our boundaries over and over and over again. And the problem is when we breach our boundaries by taking on the bulk of unpaid labor, the pay gap is reinforcing that, because 80% of the pay gap in most developed nations between men and women is because of motherhood. We take on the unpaid labor, men aren't doing it, so then organizations feel like they could pay us less because we're less committed to the workplace, and then we go on and on to this cycle. So of course, the most important thing that Fair Play stands for is the premise that nothing's going to change financially for women. We can't empower women in the workplace or anywhere outside the home unless we start to empower and invite men into their full power in the home. But practically, let's talk about how we could talk about this practically. I call them the death and divorce conversations. And it strengthens my marriage. I'll tell you that. We have this conversation every year. And now that we have a very robust estate plan and financial advisor, we don't need to have these conversations anymore because we hear from the external parties. But in the beginning, the conversation was, okay, this is what I know about the default in our state. We live in California. You may have pre-existing assets. I don't. I'm supporting my parents. I grew up poor. I have no assets. I have no help, no family help. What happens if, God forbid, you divorce me or you die? Let's practically walk through what that looks like. And then from there, you can actually start to check off a list of things that you've talked about on this podcast for sure. You can look at life insurance. Who has to replace that person if that person died? You have to look at what other type of unpaid, now paid labor you would need in the home. That unpaid labor is why I'm not in the workplace. So do you want to compensate me for that work? Do you think that work is valuable? If you don't think it's valuable, then let's discuss it. And then you can take it on to see whether or not it actually was valuable. You don't think spirituality is valuable? Okay, so our kids will never learn about a God. You don't think that thank you notes are valuable? Well, actually, that's sort of been the way we keep gratitude with your family and your mother. So I do think that when you start to talk about the Fair Play cards, we start to realize that our memories, our humanity. Who took you on grocery shopping trips? Did you go to a farmer's market? Did you go to a mark, an outdoor fair, a grocery store? What did that look like? Who planned your birthday celebrations? Do you remember any birthday celebrations? So I think what I like to say on a practical level is the death and divorce conversations are a great place to start. But again, you have to be used to having difficult conversations. And that's the biggest hurdle. We can talk about practical ways to start to get to a place of difficult conversations. Because unfortunately, most couples have never practiced communication. And so they don't know how to have difficult conversations.
Thank you. And I'd love to have a few pointers on how to start these conversations. Are these probably questions on, what's the ideal setup? Is it ever a good time to have these conversations? I'd love to have a few of these tips, please.
So number one is that I learned over 10 years of serving couples how they communicate. They're giving transactional feedback in the moment. I had to tell him to pick up the kids early. Zach is calling me, my son's calling me 20 times. The bus didn't pick him up. I had to tell him to go pick up the spicy Dijon because we were having guests over. It's a very transactional feedback in the moment. So what I'm trying to ask people to do is to do the opposite of that. To not give feedback in the moment. It means that you have to trust that there's another time that you're going to be able to give feedback. That's the hardest part. Well, if I didn't tell them now, I'm going to forget, or, I had to sort of yell about it in the moment. No, you really don't. You can hold your tongue, but you have to trust that there's a time when that person will receive this information. So what I like to say is we're looking for emotion is low, cognition is high, timing. So typically that requires some sort of set check-in time every week. And Seth and I pretty much check in, I would say, every day when emotion is lower and cognition is higher. In the beginning, it was more of a weekly, longer check-in, really understanding who was holding what fair play cards. Now that we've had the system for so many years, it's more of a shorthand. But I do think that those planning and advanced conversations are the key to a healthy marriage. And I'll give you an example out of the UK or Europe in general. There was a group in Europe called The Reasons I Hate My Husband and Partner during COVID. It had 27,000 members. And one woman wrote in the group, if my husband dies during COVID, it'll be because of me and not the disease. So I reached out to her. I said, I'm a researcher. I'm just so curious how you communicate about domestic life. And she wrote back, I don't communicate about domestic life. This is my safe space. So I think it's important for us to understand that this woman felt that publicly threatening to murder her partner in front of 27,000 strangers felt safer to her than having this conversation directly with her spouse. Why is that? That's something we all have to unpack and understand. Why is that? Why it is because women have never been conditioned to ask for what we need. And that is why fair play is a movement and not just a system. Because those boundaries, telling women you deserve to ask for what you need and explaining to them that it's not their fault has been really, really a painful transition for a lot of people.
Painful, but so important. And I love the shift in mindset, the realization that, it's something that always existed and it's challenging the status quo. And you spoke a little bit about the mental load, and I love, the way the cards work and the way they make you think about all the things you do automatically, but you don't realize that they take you a lot of time, they take you a lot of mental load. So sometimes it's hard to quantify. But you talk about unicorn space and the importance for us to reclaim time for ourselves. I love that. This is how I get my energies by, whenever I can, to try to spend time, on my own. I think it's really important and enjoying your own company, I guess. But can you talk about this alone time? How does it look like? And, how often should we take it?
I think what I want to say, and I think it's really important, is that I think we've been hijacked by happiness conversations over the past 10 years. The self-help of happiness, let alone the money it costs to sort of pursue that, the commodified wellness of what it looks like to join gyms and dye our hair and manicures and cold plunges and gratitude journaling ourselves to death. The thing I learned in writing my second book, which had to be the sequel, ironically, because when I was giving people time back from fair play, the weirdest reaction was that people said to me, well, what's the point of fair play? Because I wouldn't even know how to use my time. So there's a huge passion gap there when we are parents, partners, and professionals on repeat. And so to sort of break that cycle, we have to ask ourselves, what is the opposite of languishing? Because overwhelm and boredom were really big words that came up a lot. And the opposite of languishing or overwhelm and boredom, a lot of the things that we get from being in our roles, ironically, is not happiness. In fact, it has very little to do with happiness. But what it has to do with is bringing back being consistently interested in our own lives. If you focus on that, then that can bring happiness or all the other fear, all the other emotions it could bring for you that we need. But that is the key. Being consistently interested in our own life is the key to thriving. And again, it can manifest itself in many, many ways. But if you're going to, unfortunately, live our lives on the repeat cycle of parent, partner, professional, and on and on and on, without breaking that cycle, understanding that there can be more, then unfortunately, later on, we're going to have to spend more money on therapy and doctors, because these are things that lead to thriving as we get older.
No, thank you. I agree with you. I think, that this happiness dream is a bit difficult.
Happiness is a clue, but you feel it. Like, like if someone in your community says, thank you, we've changed XYZ, there is a purpose, a legacy that you've created that nobody can take away from you. And I think that that's the key. So many things can be taken away from us at any time, but the legacy you've left from doing those hard things, like that is what leads to, a meaningful life. And we can't get there just in our roles. We just can't.
And it's having these, difficult conversations. And it's always like driving change, for yourself, for people around you. That's where you're on your path and on your journey.
But I call it unicorn space because to space for you to be uniquely you is like a mythical beast. It doesn't automatically exist. It is a thing that we have to reclaim, hold a boundary for, tell ourselves creativity isn't optional. We deserve this time for ourselves. We deserve the permission to be unavailable from our roles. And that takes people like you and your community, because we all need each other to be able to hold firm in that boundary.
Thank you. It's powerful, and I think it's almost magical. I have one final question for you. How do you envision the future of household management evolving, particularly in terms of, gender dynamics and also work-life balance, this, time versus money? That's always quite a big conversation.
Well, the good news is that we just saw a study that the people who are reducing their work hours the most are actually white-collar men. So that's very, very exciting. But I'll tell a quick story to end, and I don't tell it that often, but it happened during the pandemic. The changes I see are small, but they have huge impacts. There was this couple, Richard and Amy, and they were doing the Fair Play system, sort of redealing the cards during the pandemic because he was working from home now and traveling less. And what they realized, as she works, flexibly, so she was always handling more of the unpaid labor for her two kids, they realized that Richard was actually really good at what I call the home suit. So great at dishes, helpful, clearing the plates, grabbing groceries for the family. But there are two other suits. There's home and out. He transported the kids to school when there was school, not pandemic life. But there are two other suits called caregiving and magic that he realized he didn't touch, these cards. So one of the cards in the magic suit is called magical beings. It's sort of our tooth fairy here. I don't know in Europe if you have other magical beings, but we have Lucky Leprechaun in America. We have Santa. We have Tooth Fairy. So he decides to be the Tooth Fairy, take on that ownership responsibility. So as you can sort of predict, the time comes for their daughter to lose her second tooth. So she already had experienced Tooth Fairy with her mother. The Tooth Fairy doesn't come. So before Fair Play, what they say to me is that this is what would have happened. Amy would have done the feedback in the moment, sort of verbal assassin. You've ruined our child's life. I knew I could never trust you. And Richard admits that he would have blamed and gone defensive communication style by blaming Amy for not reminding him to put the money under the pillow. That was their dynamic. Post Fair Play, they tell me that because he had already in advance, as we talked about earlier, explicitly defined expectations, he had taken on the magical beings card. He automatically said to his wife, to Amy, I messed up. I can't believe I slept through the Tooth Fairy, and I know this is going to hurt our daughter. So by him saying that, Amy had the space to not correct his mistake, but to let him carry through his mistake. And so she said, okay, I'm backing off. Thank you for acknowledging that this was your responsibility. I'll let you carry through your mistake. So Richard tells me he emails toothfairy@gmail.com, which apparently he gets a response from. There's a person out there responding to that email. So I want you all to know that, just in case this happens to you. And the beautiful woman or man or non-binary individual, whoever, the Tooth Fairy who responds says, pandemic is hard to get to all the teeth. I have social distancing too. I can't pick up more than, one household teeth a night. I don't want to, whatever. Supply chain issues, whatever she says in this email back. But Richard prints out the email, shows it to his daughter, and says, oh, she's saying that when she comes late, she brings double the money. And then the tooth fairy came and brought double the money. But I just feel like I know this couple, and I know the dynamic has sort of permanently changed in their relationship by this practice. And so that's what I sort of want to leave the world with, this idea that it's not going to take paid leave or universal childcare or all these things that we're waiting for in America to make a difference. It's a both and. You can start taking back, reclaiming your own time in the home, making sure that you understand that as a woman, your time is diamonds, just as much as men's time is. You deserve equal time choice over how you use your day, and that we can invite men into their full power in the home for women to step out into the full power in the world. As I said, white-collar men are decreasing their hours. CEOs under 60 are staying hybrid. The future of the workforce is changing, and that is the one beautiful thing and silver lining of the pandemic, is it accelerated that rate of change.
Thank you for listening. We have some great events and investing webinars coming up soon. Sign up to our newsletter via the link in this episode's description, and don't miss the invites.